Hello and welcome. It's a beautiful sunny day. Thank you for coming inside. We don't get enough of those in Ottawa. Um, Norway and Canada have a lot in common. We're both northern countries. We're both countries for whom oil and gas makes up a big mix of our economy. They like cross-country skiing and bobsled. We like hockey. There are some differences, but we have many similarities between the two of us as well. But in many ways, the similarities end there. Norway has taken the wealth from its oil and put almost all of it aside for the future. Norway has imposed one of the world's first carbon taxes and one of the highest carbon taxes on its oil and gas industry, and invested heavily in promoting low carbon development both at home and around the world. For us, there are potentially some really interesting lessons in Canada from how those experiments have worked out in Norway. As people will know, issues around how we manage our oil, both the economic and the environmental side, have been forefront in the Canadian political debate in the last few months. Governments in Alberta and even federally have seen their budget projections plummet rapidly in the face of dropping oil prices. There's a real debate in Canada about how do we fund future pension fund liabilities. There have been constant debates, particularly in this city, about whether or not we can put a price on oil and gas, a carbon price on oil and gas production without killing the industry. Norway's done all those things, and there could be no better person to tell us about how they've worked out than Kristin Halvorsen. And I apologize for not pronouncing your name correctly, inevitably, but she was finance minister of Norway from 2005 to 2009. So she oversaw both the carbon tax and the sovereign wealth fund. She was deputy leader of the Socialist Party in a coalition government in which she was deputy prime minister. Sorry, I almost gave you a promotion there. She was Minister of Education for the subsequent 4 years and then stepped down from politics a little over a year ago and is now the head of CICERO, which is a globally respected climate research institute in Norway. So without further ado, we're very fortunate to have Kristin Halvorsen today to talk to us a little bit about Norway's experience with carbon pricing, oil, and sustainability. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to Ottawa. I've been here before, but I think I hope that I will both interest you and inspire you by telling you some more about the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund and the carbon tax. I'm not a researcher or a scientist myself. I'm not even an academic. I quit my studies when I was elected to the Norwegian Parliament in '89, and I never returned. That is not to inspire any of the students here today. But my experience is, of course, from politics for 24 years, and I've been in the front line in defending CO2 taxes, in introducing new carbon taxes, and in trying to explain to the Norwegian public why we can't spend all the revenues from the oil and gas sector in a year or two. So let me start by telling you something about the government pension fund Global. Oil was discovered in the Norwegian sector of the continental shelf in 1969, and the production started in '71. It took about 10 years before the government revenues became substantial. And in 2012, Norway was ranked as the 6th largest exporter of gas and the 14th largest exporter of oil. Petroleum accounts for around 20% of the size of the Norwegian economy, around 30% of the state's revenue, and about half of the Norwegian exports. So in fact, we are a more oil-dependent country than Canada. For many countries, resource wealth seems to be a curse rather than a blessing. And many countries that are rich in resources perform quite badly when it comes to economic growth. In Norway, we managed to our wealth quite well, I think. We've avoided many of the traps which other resource-rich countries easily have fell into. The first installment in the fund was made in 1996. Today, the fund is considered one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. We've grown from 0 to around $1 trillion Canadian dollars in 18 years. Our pension fund is not the one and only model and will not suit all, but I hope it can be an interesting story to tell you. Just a minute, I try to cut this manuscript down. If you wave to me when I've used 30 minutes or something, then I can, yeah. The aims of the fund are twofold. Firstly, we wanted a mechanism ensuring that the petroleum wealth benefits both current and future generations. And secondly, we wanted to shelter the domestic economy from overheating due to oil-financed demand. The value of the fund currently corresponds to about 2.5 times the mainland GDP, and close to 54% of the fund is due to the net inflow of oil revenues, while 36% due to returns on the investments, and the rest is currency fluctuations. All the state petroleum revenues, including revenues from taxes, the oil and gas sector is heavily taxed in Norway by 78%, but also the CO2 taxes from the offshore activity are transferred to the fund and invested abroad. This helps shelter the domestic economy and the exchange rate from the volatility of petroleum revenues. The government should spend no more than the real rate of return of the fund in order to preserve its real value for future generations. While the capital in the fund may be spent only once, the real return enables a permanently high level of government expenditure over time. And the real return is estimated at 4%. The spending rule, this is our spending rule, it guides how much the government should use of this return, depending on the prevailing economic conditions. So that means that in periods of high economic growth, spending is less than the long-term target of 4%, and in periods of economic downturn, spending exceeds the long-term targets of 4%. So for instance, during the financial crisis, we had muscles to fight unemployment, and we have the lowest unemployment rate in Europe. This is how Keynes would, tell us to do it. The rule supports a stable economic development by allowing for a gradual increase in the spending. And there is no direct earmarking of petroleum income for specific spending purposes. It's named the pension fund. That is the narrative, makes it easier to explain to the Norwegian public why it's so important that we save a lot of the revenues from the oil and gas sector, because of the demographic situation. We will grow older in Norway, and we have a pay-as-you-go pension system. So that is of importance. But it's not earmarked, and people know that, but it's a nice story. So the fund has become an important source for funding of government expenditures. And in 2015, the transfers from the fund will cover 11% of the total budget expenses. But that is less than 4% of the real return of the fund, estimated 4%. So it's really an important part of our income. I can tell you something more about how the fund is managed, but I'll come back to you if you ask me to do so, because that is a bit technical. But the short story is that it's discussed every year in Parliament how the fund should be managed, if there are going to be some changes when it comes to risk. It is managed day by day by Norges Bank, or the Norwegian National Bank, and the Minister of Finance, they make the framework, but you can't call the Minister of Finance in Norway and ask her to invest in a specific company. You could try, but you won't get a positive answer. So let me tell you something about what the fund is investing in. The fund is different from the average investor. It's large. It has a very long investment horizon. It has few needs of liquidity, and it's government-owned. And these characteristics influence its risk-taking capability and may give advantages in certain areas compared to other investors. The overarching objective for the investments is to achieve the maximum possible return given a moderate level of risk. So it's not an instrument for achieving foreign policy goals. The fund investments are widely diversified across regions, countries, and sectors in order to reduce risk. At year end in 2014, investments were spread across 75 different countries, 47 currencies, and in excess of 9,000 different companies and more than 1,000 individual issuers. The asset allocation is well diversified, with 60% in equities, up to 5% in real estate, and the rest in bonds. We've had developed ethical guidelines connected to the fund, and I was among those members of the Norwegian Parliament that first suggested that there should be established ethical guidelines for the fund. And at first that was a controversial political issue. But we could prove that the fund was investing in, for instance, nuclear weapons or landmines, and there was a growing public opinion in support of these ethical guidelines. And the first ethical guidelines came into force in 2004 after a comprehensive public hearing. So there are several instruments to promote the fund's role as a responsible financial investor. Exclusion of companies is one of these instruments. So companies shall be excluded from the government pension fund if they produce certain products or sell weapons to specific states, and companies may also be excluded if there is an unacceptable risk that they contribute to or are responsible for grossly unethical activities, including serious or systematic human rights violations or gross corruptions. Currently, the discussion is going on in Norway when it comes to how the fund should take a more active stance on combating climate change. So the global divestment movement has an impact in Norway as well, and NGOs and several members of the parliament have argued that the fund should divest from companies engaged in coal production. Some would also like to exclude oil and gas companies. And as the director of CICERO, that is a bit double standard when all the revenues come from the oil and gas sector, but I can explain why it could be interesting. Because when you are that developed of revenues from oil and gas, and in addition invest in a lot of oil and gas companies, then you put the fund at risk. So there is, it's in fact, it's a very important discussion, but double standard, of course. There are multiple challenges connected to how the climate investment strategy for the fund should develop. First, of course, our economy is too much dependent on the oil and gas industry and from the revenues from this sector, but it also has consequences for the investment strategy for the fund, because now it's heavily invested in fossil assets, and this might become risky business when fossil fuels will be abandoned. So we need to prove and understand the climate risk, and I know that the fund and the management of the fund are working on that and trying to combine the knowledge from climate with the knowledge from the financial sector, because this is a very important issue. And then secondly, at the same time, there is a great need for investments in renewables, especially in developing countries. The fund can contribute to climate finance by increasing investments in renewables and be active in developing new climate-friendly investment instruments, such as, for instance, green bonds. CICERO, we don't issue a green bond, but we issue second opinion connected to green bonds to see how green they are. So this is, and this is in fact big, major question also on the pathway to Paris, in Paris, and beyond Paris. And of course, the world's largest sovereign wealth fund could be a very important player in developing these new needed instruments. Yeah, there will be introduced a new exclusion criterion, contribution to climate change. And the Norwegian Parliament last week decided to exclude investments in coal-fired power plants and companies which gets more than 30% of their revenues from coal-based activities. And reasoning for this, the Parliament mentioned that coal clearly contributes directly to climate change, but also that coal has become a risky asset to invest in. So I believe it's a good idea to exclude investment based on coal-based activities from the fund, and to add contribution to climate change as the new ethical criterion. When such a new climate criterion will be introduced, the fund should exclude not only coal assets, but also probably oil sand. But that is a separate ethical committee looking into that question, and they have to set some standards. But my guess and expectation will be that the Norwegian pension fund also will divest from oil sand. So I think it's going to be quite an interesting discussion. Yes, because it's hard to argue that these do not directly contribute to climate change. So that is the Norwegian example when it comes to sovereign wealth fund, and you can compare it to other funds that you know of. I'm just giving an inspiration. I think that we managed quite well, and it is in fact possible to explain people why we have to use the revenues from the oil and gas sector in a long-term perspective. It wasn't that easy when the fund had great losses during the financial crisis, because we were so heavily into, all these instruments that were affected. So let me tell you something about the Norwegian carbon taxes. 25 years ago, a social democratic prime minister, that was Gro Harlem Brundtland, she proposed to introduce a carbon tax on CO2 emissions from offshore oil and gas fields. But then she lost the election. So in fact, 1 year later, the tax was officially introduced by her successor from the Conservative Party, Mr. Syse. He is not that famous around the world, but in Norway he is very famous for officially introducing the CO2 taxes. So together with Finland and Norway, we were among the first in the world to put a price on carbon. And this is not a controversial issue in Norway now. In fact, the Labour Party and the Conservatives are competing in taking the honor of introducing it, and to be the modern in the forefront, globally leading, and so on. So there is not much discussion about this. So tax to the carbon tax. Norwegian oil and gas rank among the most environmentally friendly oil and gas sector in the world. And I just spoke to a friend of mine who's working in Statoil, and please give me the honest story about this, because I'm in Canada. I need to be honest. Well, I need to be honest everywhere. I'm sorry. But I know that you are especially interested in this topic. So they tell the following story. The first 10 years, the effect of the carbon tax was very strong. It stopped flaring in the North Sea. All our oil and gas fields are offshore. And it increased innovation connected to reduction of emissions connected to the oil and gas sector. It was very efficient. But then the effect was not taken out of it, but it wasn't that much more to develop. But it's still the fact that we have among the world's most environmental friendly oil and gas sector because of this tax. So let me say something about the size of the tax. It is about 70 Canadian dollars per ton. We have, and it's, I think it's a broad agreement in Norway that the tax has, that the effect of the tax is that both the Norwegian petroleum industry itself and the suppliers, because that is also a big industry in Norway, have been quicker and better than others to develop less polluting technologies. And for instance, already in 1996, at the Sleipner field, that a big project was set up to capture and store CO2 in the sandstone under the North Sea. And currently, a lot more is done to reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas fields. It's not only the petroleum industry that pays a carbon tax. As much as 80% of Norway's greenhouse gas emissions are subject to carbon pricing through a carbon tax or through the European Union emission trading system, or both. And these systems cover several greenhouse gases, not only CO2. We are now a member of the EU ETS system, the world's largest emission trading system. But the price on the allowances in this system is very low. So we kept, when the Norwegian oil and gas industry had to be part of this cap and trade system, we kept the CO2 tax at a bit less level, but not to reduce the cost on carbon emissions. So we know the effect of this introduction of the CO2 tax. We know that the tax is in the EU system is not that effective, but we know that it's possible to see positive results. So, well, just a few minutes ago, I told you that there was this broad Norwegian consensus about the carbon tax, and that is the fact when it comes to the carbon tax connected to the offshore sector. But let me tell you that it's not been, always an easy job to introduce new taxes when it comes to taxes at all, and especially not green taxes. But we have had several official commissions that have suggested different ways of shifting from income taxes or business taxes to green taxes. And in fact, our current conservative government, they've just mandated another commission to elaborate new measures and to prepare for a new reform. So this is an interesting topic for all political parties in Norway. We know that the public acceptance of environmental taxes on the offshore petroleum production has been relatively high, but let me tell you that it was not very easy to suggest how we should change taxation of cars, petrol, diesel in Norway. When I was serving as a finance minister, the government suggested a package. It was like a package, but part of that package was to raise the CO2 tax on car petrol and diesel with 10 øre, that is less than 2 Canadian dollar cents. So it was a very small raise, and it led to big protests. Trucks blocked the roads to our capital in protest to our plans. But we did push it through, and we added some other measures that really have had a great effect. And that is effective because it's connected to the tax on the when you buy a car. There's quite a high fiscal tax connected to buying cars in Norway. That had a fiscal reason, but we changed it. So we made it cheaper for less polluting cars, and those who buy an electric car pay no taxes at all. So this tax rebate, in combination with the taxation on petrol, has contributed to a drastic reduction of emissions from cars in Norway over the last years. Emissions from the total of new cars sold in Norway from 2008 to 2013 has gone down with 40%. So that has been a major reduction. And part of that story is that Norway has more electric cars per capita than any other country. So Norway stood for 31% of all electric cars that were sold in Europe last year. And thanks to our environmental taxes and the big demand for electric cars, we have created an interesting market for electric car producers. And in this way, our little country, we are 5 million people, contributes to the further development of the global market for electric cars. And the rapid progress in the technologies and batteries can also spur the development of electric construction machinery and buses. And that is a fact, even if it was this, very noisy, lot of protests. I think most Norwegians now are quite proud that we've had these changes in just a few years, and that we are a leading nation when it comes to having electric cars. So let me conclude. Of course, the most effective measure for reducing greenhouse gas emissions would be global carbon pricing. All researchers agree on this, and most politicians know it. Putting a price on carbon across the globe is, however, not a likely outcome of the Paris climate negotiations later this year, nor is it within reaching in the coming years. But a growing number of countries and regions are, however, introducing carbon pricing measures. According to the World Bank, almost 40 countries and more than 20 cities, states and provinces already use carbon pricing mechanisms or are planning to implement them. And these areas are responsible for more than 22% of global emissions. Others are developing or considering systems that will put a price on carbon in the future. And altogether, these actions will encompass almost half of the global CO2 emissions. So we know that where carbon pricing measures are in vigor, emissions do go down and carbon pricing do work. And also private sector support is growing. And many companies operate in countries that have carbon pricing systems in place now, and they are developing the expertise in both managing their emissions and incorporating a real or a shadow carbon price in their planning and investments. We have companies coming to us to ask us and to give them advice when it comes to how they can work with a shadow carbon price to prepare for a new international deal on carbon pricing. So this brings me to my conclusion. Countries that are among the first to introduce carbon pricing will have a comparative advantage over the laggards, as business in the forward-leaning countries will sooner make the transition to a low-carbon economy. In the long run, this will be a triple win for business, for the country as a whole, and for the global climate. Thank you very much.
So I know we do have a little bit of time for questions. We worked hard today, but what I might do is, you were kind enough not to make the comparisons to Canada. But for those in the room who don't have daily knowledge of this stuff, I'll give you a couple of them. So from the sovereign wealth fund perspective, while Norway's is over $1 trillion, Alberta's is now about 17 billion. Alberta started earlier and has produced more oil during that time. In fact, it's actually one of the models Norway looked at when they went to create their fund back in the 80s. They just stuck with the model. One of the results of that is when the oil price dipped this year, Norway actually is not facing a budget deficit, and as Jim Prentice will tell you, Alberta is facing a bit of a budget deficit. From a carbon tax perspective, their tax is about $72 a ton. The highest one in Canada is 30 in BC. Alberta and Quebec and Southern Ontario are in at about 15 a ton. So just to give you a sense, the price levels are much higher than that. Anyway, over to you guys for ask questions.
I'm a victim of Norway envy. And I'm hoping more people in our country are. Would you tell us which Canadian companies your sovereign fund invests in? Do you know?
I can look it up. It's
No, I was just curious, you know.
no. Then I have to. I think that it is. If you go to the web pages of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, I think they report it every year or something. But it's 9,000 companies
Oh.
throughout the world. So and and we are not going to invest or to we are investing. I think it's 1.3% in average in each and every company. That is to spread the risk. So we won't be, you know, a major owner in any of your companies.
Just a related question: are you an active shareholder? Do you take positions on let's say, CEO salaries, that sort of thing?
Yeah, we are active, contacting other owners, and in the general meetings of the companies, but we are not taking positions in the boards or holding positions. I'm sorry.
I found your presentation really interesting, and I was inspired to see some of the examples around, for example, the way Norway has been talking about using its energy revenues to fund investments in renewables, and that's a discussion I think we haven't had in Canada, and it would be important to have. The electric vehicle initiative is very impressive. A lot of impressive things. I was looking online just to get some numbers, looked at the European Environment Agency data, and Norway's greenhouse gas emissions went up 5.8% from 1990 to 2011, despite carbon pricing. Looked at the Climate Action Tracker website, which ranks countries, gave Norway a medium grade. Not terrible, not great, but
That's right.
points out that Norway's actions are not consistent with the world being on track to avoiding 2 degrees Celsius of warming. So is it fair to say, just in terms of how we look at it from a Canadian perspective, that Norway certainly gives a better example of how an oil producer can respond to climate change, but doesn't yet offer a successful example from an environmental perspective of being on track to doing what needs to be
Yeah.
done in terms of carbon reduction?
Yeah, well, it's hard for an oil and gas producing country to be the leading nation when it comes to climate issues. That is the fact. But we can do the best of it, and I think that we've tried to do the best of it. But the next discussion in Norway is the fact that the IPCC assessment report tells us that 2/3 of the known resources connected to fossil coal, oil, and gas has to stay in the ground not being exploited if we are going to stick to the 2-degree target. And that means that we have to stop opening new fields and to transform our economy from a fossil-based economy and into a renewable economy. So that is an ongoing discussion in Norway. It's a really important discussion.
Maureen Irish from the University of Windsor. I noted in the description of the panel that it talks about a tax being imposed on Norwegian production with a higher tax on trading partners. And I wondered about this issue of border tax adjustments that comes up all the time when countries are talking about a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. Did anyone worry about illegality under the WTO? And if so, is there likely to be some discussion of potential waivers under the WTO that might be needed if these taxes are to go ahead, and if there are to be border taxes in order to make carbon taxing politically acceptable? I don't know if my question is clear, but there are some trade
I think I
issues.
need maybe an explanation.
Yeah, there may have been either a typo in the program or you misread it. It should say a higher price than trading partners as opposed to on.
Oh,
So if
instead
it
of
does say,
on.
If it actually does say on, then that's a typo.
Okay.
You want to answer the question about border tax adjustments, but
Oh,
we're not.
okay, I may have misread the
Yeah.
description. So was the tax imposed without a border tax adjustment for any imports?
Yeah, the border tax adjustment has not been a big question, but the competition between countries and regions and parts of the world, not so much connected to the oil and gas sector because the profit in this sector has been very high, but to all other industries. That has been a big issue because we also have big resources connected to hydropower. Most of our electricity comes from hydropower. And for instance, the aluminium industry would protest, say, okay, this is the most environmental friendly aluminium in the world because we use electricity based on hydropower when we produce it. So why should you tax us? Because they have some, of course, CO2 emissions connected to the process. And we had quite a pragmatic dialogue with them, I say. So we found a way to balance for other industries. But I think that what is very important to do when you are trying to be ahead when it comes to carbon taxes is to be in a dialogue with industries and try to find how much it is, how taxes can encourage them to develop and innovate the way they produce and what they produce. And I think that we have been quite successful by doing that in Norway. I'm not sure if the industry will tell the exactly same story here, but yeah, it's important though.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm a big fan of carbon taxes, so I applaud Norway's tax and management of the revenues from the oil industry. But I wanted to draw another parallel between Canada and Norway in that when we talk about emissions from the oil and gas industry, we're typically, almost always, only talking about the emissions within our own countries and not the much larger emissions that result from the carbon we're exporting.
That's right.
And I'm wondering if you can comment on your Cicero colleague Glenn Peters' work that
Yes.
shows that Norway is exporting 10 times more carbon than it is burning within. So sort of the efforts to reduce Norway's own emissions are swamped by the emissions that Norway is contributing to, much like Canada, elsewhere around the world, and to what degree that has come into play in political debates in Norway.
Yes, that's a very important perspective, and Glenn Peters is always, making a lot of noise about that, or it's a controversial fact. But of course, that is part of the international discussion connected to who is going to pay the tax, the consumer or the producer or both. But it's part of the story about how Norway contributes to global warming. So I think it's possible to, to show that as a fact, our responsibility, and in the same time, when we come to discuss taxation, we have a bit more another perspective. Yeah. So.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Really a terrific opportunity for us to hear from you on these issues from the Norwegian perspective. Tessa Hebb, Carleton University. My area of research and specialty is responsible investment. So I know the Norwegian Pension Fund and follow it closely as a leader in responsible investment. And I've been very curious about, as you know, initially the staff of the pension fund did not embrace the idea of divestment from fossil fuel, and it has been the legislature that has now come in, particularly on coal. One of the arguments is that there isn't enough opportunities currently for investment in renewables to offset that divestment in fossil fuels, particularly if we start to include oil and gas. And I'm just curious as to your response to that issue that's raised by responsible investors, that they may not have easy substitutes to put that investment in.
Yeah, well, I think it's natural that it's a political initiative behind the exclusion of, for instance, coal and the development of the ethical guidelines for the fund. I wouldn't expect Norges Bank or the fund to be those who suggest that kind of new guidelines for the fund. So that is not so surprising. But it is right that one of the arguments against divesting from oil and gas and replace it with renewables is that there are not that many projects to actually invest in. But we have a small fraction or portion of the fund who are part of developing these markets. So I think that could change in some few years. Let's hope. We really need, huge investments in renewables, especially in developing countries.
Hi, my name's Robert. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. As I understand it, your sovereign wealth fund has now the policy that you don't invest in coal or major coal companies?
That was the Parliament decided just a week ago.
Okay, so presumably the decision was taken because of the emissions. Now, of course, coal, oil, and gas do different things, but I'm just brainstorming here and thinking out into the future. As you know, much of the world's electricity is generated by coal, which is very cheap. But let's suppose that this campaign succeeds and we move towards get onto a low carbon pathway. Then 50 years from now or so, we're generating, if we've succeeded, we're generating electricity from clean sources, from renewables. Right now, the baseline forecasts are we won't get more than 15% from, say, wind and solar in any reasonable time frame. But if we succeed, then at that point, electric vehicles would become feasible. And at that point, we could begin to think about seriously reducing oil as well. So I guess my question is on the level of Statoil. Has Statoil begun to seriously think about a transition to a post-carbon economy and fundamental transition of its business?
Well, I think they could be a bit more forward-lean. They are investing in windmills in not that big scale. But I think that they are really discussing their new strategy and how they should develop their company. We don't have that many examples that an oil and gas producer,
It hasn't happened
changes.
yet, no.
No. But Statoil could be the first one. That would be nice. Well, I think they understand more and more, and they are more and more aware of the situation and following it very closely. They are now part of the 6 oil and gas producing companies in Europe that ask for a carbon tax. Of course, because gas is a less emitter than oil, that would benefit Statoil the first decades. But then, of course, they have to transform.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just ask you one question and we can wrap it up. One of the things that I guess I'm curious about, and there's many questions I'd love to ask you about the carbon tax itself. And if those of you who don't know, there will be a panel tomorrow from 1 to 5 with Kristen as well as France's former Environment Minister, Premier Jean Charest of Quebec, and several of the world's top political scientists looking at the politics of carbon pricing, trying to learn both from an academic and an applied perspective how countries have actually managed to bring in carbon pricing. So I'm going to park those questions for tomorrow. But I'm interested in the politics of a sovereign wealth fund. Alberta set out on the same journey that Norway took, and yet the temptation for politicians to put their hand in the cookie jar in times when oil prices drop down, when there's a demand for higher wages, just all of the demands on politicians from a country that would like you to spend more to provide services, particularly when oil prices fluctuate. How has Norway resisted the temptation to reach into that capital fund and use it to meet current needs in a way that Alberta and Saskatchewan, by the way, which set out to do the same thing in Canada, have not managed to do? Any ideas?
Yeah, well, well, at first, how do I explain this? The revenues that are, it was not that many billions to put into the fund. So that discussion has been ongoing, but now the real return from the fund is so large that it's not possible to avoid overheating of the economy and use 4% every year. So in fact, we are lower than 4% when we look into the average over years. So the fund has now grown, and the challenge is now to explain why we can't use the real return estimated to 4%. Not because of the reduction of the fund, but because it would overheat Norwegian economy. So, but I've been in the front line explaining why we shouldn't spend all the revenues from the fund. I think people understand that quite well, but it's always very hard to explain why we can't just use 1 more billion. 1 more, it must be possible. So that is, yeah, but that's the job of a finance minister. It's to look sad. It's not possible. No. I really enjoyed, spending all this money during the financial crisis. That was really very fun, because then it was very easy to explain the advantages of having this fund and the fiscal rule connected to it, because then it was possible to use. We had all the muscles that we needed and all the money that we needed to fight unemployment.
Well, we need more finance ministers like you in Canada. If you're looking to immigrate, listen, thank you so much for taking the time to come here. And as I said, if you like that, come back again tomorrow from 1 to 5, and you'll hear her and 5 others talking about this broader question of the politics and effectiveness of carbon pricing. So thank you.
Thank you very much.